Yeah, so I'd say let's start this. So I'm just going to introduce myself first. So my name is Francis Bellefeuille. I'm a product specialist at Fujifilm Canada, and today I will be somewhat the moderator for this presentation. So we have an amazing presentation by Brian Minear, which is an amazing landscape photographer, and you'll see throughout the presentation a bunch of breathtaking images. He went out on a trip to the American Southwest. That's right.
Yep.
Yeah. So a little bit of a story on this trip using the GFX 100S. So the only thing really I want to say is first try to keep yourself muted because we don't want to disrupt the presentation. But if you do have any questions for Brian, please put them in the chat, and then Brian will at some point during the presentation stop and then ask me if there's any question, and then from there I will ask him the question. So please use the chat for that, and then yeah, I will leave it to you, Brian.
Awesome. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you. So as Francis said, I'm Brian Minear. I'm a landscape photographer based in the US. More specifically, I'm in Michigan, which isn't exactly known for its epic landscapes. But yeah, I'm here to talk to you about this incredible camera that we're looking at right now. It's sitting here next to me. I feel like when people look at the title of this presentation, this is actually like the title card for the YouTube video that I shot on this this kind of whole experience. And I called it the landscape photography camera of my dreams. And it seems like it's hyperbole, but it's really not. And that's kind of what I want to get into today. Like I'm really just going to tell my story because that's all I can do, right? Is talk from kind of a place of experience with the camera. And then, just kind of highlight some of the key features that stick out to me as a landscape photographer, some of the things that I really love about the camera. So yeah, I had it for, gosh, I think I had it for about 2 weeks initially, and then I had to send my pre-production model back. And then I went without one for about a month, and then finally got my own personal one, which was amazing. But 2 weeks to create like a myriad of launch content for this thing, and it was an incredibly tight deadline. But yeah, so let's just dive in here. So in a lot of ways, it really kind of took me by surprise just how much I love shooting with this camera. Like I talked about, like I can only talk from a place of experience. I'm not like gonna dig into like the tech specs. It's been out for a while. If you're here watching this, chances are you know all of the tech specs. I'm not just gonna sit here and regurgitate them to you. I just want to talk about the things that I really love about the camera. And like Francis said, use the Q&A feature, use the chat, ask questions. I thrive on kind of that dialogue. And yeah, so let's just dive in here. So here's kind of a comparison to an X-T4, just because I feel like the size is one of the biggest selling points of this camera. I mean, it's a medium format camera with its sensor stabilization, and yet it's roughly the size of an APS-C size camera. And that kind of blows my mind away. For me as a landscape photographer, I like to travel light. And this kind of fits right there with the rest of my gear. I don't think I'm ever going to be a sole GFX shooter. I like kind of bouncing back and forth, and we'll talk more about that later on in the presentation. But I feel like, my whole purpose for going mirrorless in the first place was just to dump the size and the weight of just these full frame DSLRs. And I really feel like this camera is kind of a level up in the mirrorless world where you're getting all the benefits of this massive sensor with so much resolution and dynamic range in just a tiny package, which is awesome. So like I said, I love the size. I love the versatility of the X series so much. And, that's another reason why this camera is a standout for me. It pairs with my X-T4 so well. I think, not only am I sharing batteries between the two cameras, but I think they fit side by side with each other right in my bag. I'm always kind of shooting with two camera bodies. So for my personal GFX 100S, I ended up getting the GF 100 to 200 millimeter lens, which you can see on the camera right there. And then I also have the 30 millimeter f3.5 prime. And so typically when I go out, I like to have a telephoto on one camera and a wide angle on the other. So normally if I have the 100 to 200 on the GFX, I'll bring my X-T4 with either a 10 to 24 or a 16. Or if I go with the 30 on the GFX, then I'll put my 50 to 140 on the X-T4. And I kind of like dual shooting that way. So one of the first things that I noticed when I started dealing with this camera, just right out of the box, is the PASM dial that you can see right there on the top right. I'm gonna admit I was kind of hesitant at first because this camera does away with like the shutter speed, the ISO dials that I've come to love on the system. I know that's one of the big things that Fujifilm shooters love, right? Is these physical dials where you're getting to manipulate the control. But I can say you acclimate so quickly to this, and it's really easy to adjust to that kind of front and rear command dial adjustment of your ISO and your shutter speed. And then obviously you still have the aperture on the control on the lens. But I just think it really still does maintain that same kind of just great ergonomic setup that the Fujifilm cameras are known for. So for me, with this PASM dial, one of the things that I love is that you can assign a custom setting there are 6 different custom settings on the dial, and you can assign everything. Coming from Fujifilm land, like we're used to assigning like custom JPEG recipes, and this expands so much on that. So, my C1 setup is kind of my run and gun. It's aperture priority, multimetering mode, and then you can see my film simulation recipe right there. But with just a flip of the dial, I can be in my C2 astrophotography mode where it changes my ISO, it changes the manual mode, it bumps my shutter speed all the way down, and then obviously changes the film simulation recipes again, turns the long exposure and noise reduction and the IBIS off, because obviously for astrophotography, I'm shooting on a tripod. And then it turns the 2-second selfie timer on because I don't have a remote release. I just like that extra little 2 seconds of the camera stabilizing before the shot. And so I don't know, it's so great for all different kinds of photographers, because in a quick switch, you can be in a totally different shooting mode. I used to shoot in the studio or with strobes a lot. And with mirrorless cameras, it's nice to have that exposure, preview, and white balance turned off, because it kind of messes with your strobes. If you have the exposure preview on, all you're seeing is black. So if you turn that off, so, I could see a studio photographer having that set up as one of their custom settings where they can and it just saves you so much time and digging in menus. So you can see here some of my different, custom menus that I've set up on the camera. Just as I've been shooting with it. And it's just really nice. It really just helps you. I think one of the things that I love about Fujifilm cameras so much is that they just kind of become an extension of your body, and it gets out of the way. It lets you focus on what you're shooting, where, instead of focusing on digging through a menu or whatever. And I think this takes it that whole idea a step further, where you just kind of become one with the camera and you're out there shooting and your nose isn't buried into a menu. Okay, so I had about a week and a half to get acclimated to this camera before I left for my trip. As Francis mentioned, I went to the Southwest. I went to Arizona, and then some of the trip I was in southern Utah, and Michigan. It was winter. It's December. It's early January. It's not great. I'm sure Canada, you can kind of gel with me there, but I knew I needed to go somewhere else because the winters here are so unpredictable. I can go months at a time without seeing the sun. So I picked Arizona because obviously like desert is a great escape from the winter here. And, I took it out for a few days. Luckily the sun did come out, and I got to play with the 100 to 200 lens and make this image right here. But yeah, it ended up being one of the lenses that I bought. I just really fell in love with that focal range. So this is probably the best and the luckiest image that I made before I left for Arizona. The sun was trying to break through all of this beautiful fog. It was awesome. There was this light dusting of snow the night before, so you can see it kind of there on the branches of the trees. This is like my favorite lone tree that I photograph all the time, constantly, because again, we don't have epic landscape scenes. I have like rural farmland to shoot when I'm not getting to travel, which I've gotten very used to during the pandemic. But yeah, this is a scene that I have always wanted to capture, just that beautiful warm to cool contrast. This light maybe lasted for like 45 seconds to a minute. And it was just absolutely beautiful. And here's kind of 100% crop in there showing off the crazy 100 megapixel resolution, but then also so you can see the snow that's kind of dusted on the branches there. I don't have a lot of things, great epic things to shoot around me. So, you know, anytime this kind of opportunity presents itself, it's, you know, it's pretty awesome. Lucky, lucky, lucky. So I think my biggest thing that I was trying to do early on was just getting a feel for like the overall speed of the camera, the performance of the camera, just so I knew any limitations, right? As a landscape photographer, I don't typically need the world's fastest frame rates or blazing autofocus, but I'm going to show you a few photos throughout this that's going to clearly demonstrate how accurate the autofocus system, and then just how responsive. You can see here on the right, I caught that bird kind of mid-flight jumping, or not, yeah, kind of flying off of a branch. I sat there waiting for any one of these birds to take off, and luckily it was that one that's like perfectly on the edge of the frame, and I caught it, which was awesome. But just the responsiveness of the camera for being, you know, as beastly as it is of a medium format camera. You know, it has autofocus, it has phase detect autofocus that's covering almost like 99% of the sensor, which is totally awesome. And I just think there's really no other medium format camera like it. So yeah, that's a couple more shots. So one of the things that I get asked a lot about is the new film simulation mode. And this is kind of the last thing I think we'll talk about before we break for some questions. But I wanted to show kind of a side-by-side of, you know, this new film simulation. All the way to the right, you can see Nostalgic Neg. I don't know how well it's going to come through the web feed, but hopefully you get an idea here of what it looks like. So here I'll just run through them. There's Velvia, Provia, Classic Negative, Nostalgic Negative. So flipping back and forth between the two, you can see how it's kind of warmer, it's softer, where Classic Negative is kind of hard shadows and cool. It's got that blue-green tint in the shadows. It was really fun to shoot with. And I think, you know, anytime Fujifilm adds a film simulation, I'm super happy because I love them so much. Here's another Nostalgic Negative shot, which is more recent. I just took this a couple weeks ago, driving around. I just love the color palette that you get off of this this new film simulation. So for the trip, I was assigned. Well, let's take a break real quick before we go any further. Do we have any questions, Francis?
We are good.
Cool.
You can, yeah.
Then I'll continue. I'll take a drink real quick and continue.
No worries.
All right. So for the trip, for the actual Arizona trip, I was assigned 3 GF lenses, just so, you know, Fujifilm had like a decent amount of, you know, everybody that had a camera was kind of assigned lenses, so they had full coverage of everything. So everything that you see from kind of this point on was either shot with the GF 23 millimeter lens, the wide angle, the GF 30 millimeter lens, or the GF 120 millimeter f4 lens. So I had a pretty decent of like focal length assortment to choose from on my trip. Of the 3, I had the least amount of experience with the 120, but I mean, obviously you kind of, you know, I went with the 100 to 200 lens. I am such a telephoto shooter. I don't know if it's just a result of me living in Michigan where I don't have a lot of good wide angle type scenes. And I just love, you know, zooming in and being able to compress certain things together. So knowing that the 120 was the longest lens that I had, I knew I was going to have to, I'm going to have to like it. Whether, you know, regardless. So, you know, here's a great example of just how amazing the resolution of the camera is. 120 millimeter lens, and you can still get a pretty decent close-up image of the moon. You know, so I think one of the things that really stuck out to me is just the overall quality, the dynamic range, and the colors coming off of this massive sensor. I shot pretty much everything in 16-bit RAW. Most of what I've shown you up to this point have been just edited JPEGs straight out of the camera. But I think as we shift this image and then into the Arizona stuff, it's going to be mostly 16-bit RAW files. I really wanted to put that to task and just kind of see how that fit in my workflow. I've had a lot of friends tell me that, you know, as I post images, they can usually tell the difference between when I post an X series shot or a camera or a photo shot with an X series camera versus something that I've shot with the GFX camera. And I think that has to do with just the available tonality and then the colors. Like there's just something about the saturation of the colors and the natural colors coming off of the sensor that, I don't know, it blows up on a whole new world when it comes to post-processing. But anyway, so, you know, I got a feel for this whole camera, right? I got my custom modes dialed in. I knew I wanted to have that kind of just forethought of not having to fumble around in the dark on this new camera that I've never held before. So thankfully I was afforded some opportunities, you know, to get to know it. So let's dive in. So after my direct flight from Detroit to Phoenix, I hopped in a rental car and I drove straight to Prescott, Arizona, which destination one was this spot. It's called Watson Lake. I'd never been here before. I'd only been to Arizona once before this trip. But I'd never been here before. I found it just when I was researching, kind of scouting locations. I actually scouted with the Google Earth desktop app, which is awesome because it shows kind of terrain, found like where I wanted to be based on, you know, where the layers fit together and everything. But, you know, I just thought it looked incredibly unique. I knew one thing that I really wanted to show off about this camera was its capabilities with dynamic range. I think that's a whole... I've seen so many people talk about, well, you know, this full frame camera is, you know, really high resolution. It kind of maybe compare. And I think the one thing that always gets lost is the fact that with the medium format sensor, you just have so much more information, you know, out of these raw files. And so where, you know, typically when I'm shooting with the X series cameras, when I'm shooting a really high dynamic range scene, I'm bracketing just in case I want to be able to merge those shots together in post, you know, to kind of limit the amount of noise that I'm seeing or just maximize the dynamic range. And with this camera, you don't need to bracket. So I knew this spot was going to be perfect for showing off, you know, when the sun hits those rock walls and just lights up in the background versus the foreground being completely in shadow. You know, and obviously the rocks lit up exactly as I hoped they would when I was planning. And you know, here's another shot with the 120. I really did kind of fall in love with that field of view. But I just loved kind of picking out these interesting compositions in the rocks and showcasing the crazy dynamic range that you can get from the shadows in the foreground, you know, still maintaining so much detail. And, you know, you just get this massive sense of scale and stuff, which is totally awesome. It's why I love shooting telephoto. So once that amazing light ended, I got this really beautiful kind of pinkish glow, that afterglow right before blue hour. And, you know, it's just kind of breathtaking to sit there and just experience. And I think, you know, I'm going to repeat this over and over again, but one of the biggest like things that hit me about this camera is its hand holdability. You can see with this shot right here is I was shooting at f1 or f7.1 and 1/20th of a second, again with the 120 millimeter lens, and it's completely sharp handheld. You know, I'm coming from shooting the GFX 50S camera, which absolutely loved, but there was always like a breaking point of where I'm gonna have to shoot on a tripod, just because, you know, it's medium format. It's just, you just had to. I'm have very small hands anyway, so it's hard for me to hold a bigger camera. Or it's hard for me to hold it stabilized, right? So yeah, I think this camera really unlocks that ability to be able to shoot really into, you know, after the sun has set, into darker conditions without having to go on a tripod, which really totally opens up a lot for a landscape photographer. So another one of my side goals for this trip was to see how this camera would handle astrophotography. And we're not going to go into like left field astrophotography class, but I will say that the larger sensor, you know, and the resolution really make shooting astro kind of interesting, kind of difficult, because you can only have your shutter open for a certain period of time before you start getting the stars to blurring from the rotation of the Earth. And obviously, as the sensor size goes up and the resolution gets bigger, that window kind of shortens and shortens. So with the 30 millimeter lens, I could only shoot at 8 seconds. You can see down there in the bottom right, before the stars started to blur from the rotation of the Earth. That's not a huge amount of time. So I ended up having to bump the ISO up a fair amount. Usually on my X series cameras, I'm trying to stay between 64. I don't like going over 6400. So I tried to stay between like 800 to 1600 maybe sometimes 3200. That's kind of my sweet spot. But with this ISO 8000, you can see I got some really good results, even though there's some light pollution, that orange glow on the skyline there. But I think it's just a testament to what this camera is capable of. Again, with some Astro the next morning, I went out to shoot these red rocks. My plan was to climb the rock there on the right. It's called Bell Rock. I was going to kind of hike up to a vantage point. I ended up getting, we'll get there. I ended up getting lost and not being where I was supposed to be. But yeah, so before I got there, I just noticed, still how clear the sky was, and figured I'd stop and give Astro another attempt. This time I switched to the 23 because typically when the wider focal length you're using, the longer a shutter speed you can get. So on the 23 millimeter lens, I could actually increase my shutter speed to 15 seconds from 8. Now I know the bottom right there says 25, and I'll tell you why. This is actually an exposure blend. So the sky was actually taken at 15 seconds, and then the foreground rocks were taken at 25 seconds, and then I blurred them or merged them together in post. So that's why it says 25 seconds down there in the bottom. But again, just kind of showing what you can do with this camera with minimal amounts of post-processing effort. Really happy with it, and still really happy with the colors. You can see I'm still high ISOs there, 6400. So I ended up getting completely lost, like I said, and just kind of had to find my own way. One of the beautiful things that I found were all these beautiful cactuses in the foreground. So this is still pre-sunrise coming up, and I keep meaning to add the EXIF data to this one. This is another handheld shot pre-sunrise. Still tack sharp with the 23 millimeter lens. But I was just kind of hanging out, waiting for the sun to light up the rocks. So again, this wasn't a difficult hike. I mean, I made it difficult because I got lost, and I'm like traversing, edging kind of along cliff sides with all these loose rocks hanging out. But again, going back to me as a landscape photographer, enjoying the small kind of, just the compactness of this camera, having such a capable, incredible medium format camera that, can go out with me. It just gives me hope for longer backpacking trips where I'm planning to do a lot more hiking. And I know that I'm not going to have this massive amount of gear to haul around with me. So next up, I kind of worked my way back around. This day was like my sunrise. I mean, you saw I started when the stars were still out, pre-sunrise, clear through after dark. This was going to be my longest day of the entire trip. I actually had to drive from Sedona all the way to southern Utah to make it to a spot called White Pocket, which we're going to see in just a second. But as I worked my way back around Bell Rock, I'm just noticing all the light coming up. It's just beautiful seeing all of those, the kind of glow hitting the tops of the mountains there. I at a previous trip to Arizona, the only other time I'd been there, my wife and I stopped at a state park called Slide Rock State Park. And I knew that they had a couple little tiny waterfalls. And again, just based on how I was seeing the shadows falling, I knew this would be another great example of dynamic range. So I show up to the spot where I knew, the foreground waterfall is probably going to be completely in shadow. And then you have just the sun hitting these massive rocks on the top there. And you can see here, I have an ND filter holder on the end of my lens. And normally in this situation, I would actually be using a graduated ND just to manually help me bring down this huge amount of exposure in the top of the frame. But I ended up not having to do that because the dynamic range off these files is just absolutely incredible. So you can see, even though the foreground's completely in shadow for this waterfall and the background, some of those rocks up at the top, you can see are like just on the verge of hitting that, white point clipping overexposure, but I was able to retain all of those highlights, which was completely awesome. So again, just a testament to what this camera can do. Take a second. We have anything, Francis? You want to take a minute, or are we good?
We are still good. I guess
Cool.
You're pretty clear on everything, so that's good.
Sounds awesome. Or just save the questions for the end. We can have a discussion there too. Okay, so moving on. So kind of I kind of planned this whole trip around getting to go to one specific spot. I just mentioned it, called White Pocket. Um, some of you have probably heard of it if you're interested in landscape photography. Um, but it's just this very unique kind of otherworldly looking spot. I actually had to hire a guide company to get me out there because it's pretty crazy. And it changes depending on the time of the year. Sometimes it's too muddy, sometimes it's too sandy. And so I knew I had like a set amount of time to achieve a certain amount of goals. And so I wanted to minimize the risk involved and not get a, rental car stuck and have to pay this huge fee. So anyway, I had to drive about 4.5 hours from here to southern Utah and meet a guide who then, lowered the tire pressure in all of the tires. And then we, embarked on this journey out to White Pocket. And it didn't disappoint, so it's truly like another planet. The textures and colors were just everything that I hoped that they would be. And normally I wouldn't be shooting in this kind of light, right? This just kind of like midday harsh light is just when I'm out scouting and not shooting with my camera, but I couldn't help myself because it was so beautiful. So I spent a solid hour and a half or so leading up to golden hour, just kind of scouting where I wanted to be and planning where, which shots I wanted. The 23 millimeter lens really shined here just because, I think as a landscape photographer, I really love kind of foreground elements or leading lines leading into the frame. I love getting low to the ground like this shot and kind of utilizing that interesting texture and color, kind of leading you back. This is like some kind of volcano looking thing. It's just absolutely amazing. I seriously was walking around with just, my mouth open the whole time. My guide was laughing at me. But yeah, like these are my favorite kinds of locations to shoot, just because there's so much that you can do here. It's almost overwhelming, right? Walking around and trying to figure out, okay, I have this small window where I'm going to be able to shoot when the light is absolutely perfect. What am I going to do? Again, going back to the camera having sensor stabilization, the IBIS, truly incredible, not having to like set up a tripod, set up do all of that stuff. I was running and gunning the entire time that I was here. But there were all these wispy clouds you can kind of see there in the sky. So I was like, the whole even drive there, I was seeing like clouds, and I was like, I feel like it might happen tonight. It's notorious that I get either completely skunked or there's no clouds at all when I try to do this sort of thing. So yeah, it was even leading up. You can see the golden light here. And then all of a sudden it's like completely covered, and the colors are still spectacular from the little bit of sunset glow or the sun glow that we were getting, the kind of diffused light. And the person standing there in the background was Sunny. She was my guide that took me out the White Pocket. And then at like the last possible moment, I was getting ready to put all of my gear back away and just kind of sit. Every now and then I'll try to take, a few minutes just to like experience, I figured I've got all the shots that I need. And then the light the sky just lit up, not like over us, but like way off in the background. The sky just got this glow that I've never really seen before. It was kind of interesting. But I took the shot with the 30 millimeter lens, and then I was like, I feel like I got to switch to the one. I ran, stepped back, threw the 120 on, and got my trophy shot for the entire trip, which was this. I could have left Arizona at this point and been completely done. It would have been totally worth it. And it was awesome. I was planning on shooting some astro, but the clouds were kind of iffy. So after I got this shot, we just headed right back. Because it was like hour and a half, 2 hours just to get back to the car. And then ended up going to Page, getting a cheap hotel. And this is the first time that I could like dive into my images, right? Up to this point, I had only been editing JPEGs, mainly because there was no software that let me edit RAW files. Thankfully, I'm a Capture One ambassador, so they got me an early beta of the software. And so open up Capture One and I start processing these files. And this is where I'm like, oh, okay, like now I understand this 16-bit thing. Like it's incredible. These colors and everything are amazing, and seeing the dynamic range and all that stuff. And so this is where I really started falling in love with everything. But I think a lot of people, and what I've heard from a lot of people is, yeah, but I don't know if I need 100 megapixels, or I just don't want to buy more hard drives to back up all the files. and that sort of thing, which I totally understand, right? But I will say this. So even on the X series cameras, I shoot the lossless compressed files. So lossless compression, people tend to see compression and they like get scared away because they don't want, like, you know, we know like JPEG compression, we don't want that, right? But Fujifilm's lossless compression is actually just this beautiful thing that shrinks the files down without any lossless, right? It's lossless, so without any sort of quality loss. So you get like great file sizes, even though you're shooting, you know, a raw file. So on the GFX 100S, I shot lossless compressed 14 and 16-bit files, and most of the time, the 14-bit files were between 60 and 70 megabytes. So it's really not that crazy, you know. And to people saying, I don't know if I need 100 megapixel resolution, totally understand. But at the same time, you get so much croppability, or you can just scale down your files in post. You know, it's just, there's a lot of things that having that extra resolution comes in very handy for. And you know, your hard drives don't take that much of a hit that you think that they would. So the next morning was kind of interesting. I was dog tired at this point from all the driving, but I kind of decided, okay, I'm going to take it easy. Woke up in Page. I drove out to this little lookout point. This is Powell Lake. She was looking at kind of the south side of Powell Lake, and you can see the marina down there in the left hand of the screen. And I was just going to take a couple shots here and then start driving because I needed to get back to the Grand Canyon, basically drive all the way back, you know, where I just came from. And then I saw these clouds and I was like, oh, this might be like the best. I'm kind of a cloud. I call myself a cloud junkie. I'm always looking at, you know, beautiful clouds. And so I was like, I can't not do something with this. I got this shot and I'm like, am I really just going to stand here and take this shot over and over again while the sun comes up? And I remembered my guide had actually told me about a few spots. She was based out of Kanab, Utah. So she had told me about a few spots that I needed to visit closer to Kanab. But there was a spot called the Toadstools, which was just maybe 5 minutes from where I parked to meet her to go to White Pocket, about 20 minutes from here. And I was like, oh, I wonder if I have time to make it. So I like packed up all my stuff. I booked it. And there was like about a 3/4 of a mile hike out to the actual spot. Just had to run the whole way. If you go watch my YouTube video, you can see me out of breath and like talking about the whole thing. It's quite fun. But I made it. And, you know, after this huge jog, I got there, you know, right before the colors in the sky really started to light up. You could see that pre-sunrise glow hitting those beautiful rock formations. And I was just like, oh, I was so in it at this point. It was so much fun. So without a doubt, like super happy that I decided to make that happen, even though I was extremely tired. But, you know, I was just even happier that I was getting to experience all these things with this kind of new camera, getting to show off what it could really do. And I think, you know, I hear a lot of people talk about like this medium format look. And most of the time that refers to like bokeh, right? You're getting more bokeh out of it or whatever. That's not really the kind of shooter that I am, right? But I think, you know, as it pertains to landscape photography, it's just so hard to describe that medium format look. And I think what it comes down to for me is that, you know, just that larger sensor, the more detail, more dynamic range, like that's what it means to me. I feel like, you know, I was shooting side by side with my X series cameras pretty much this entire time. I use my X100V to take a lot of the product shots that I've been showing throughout this presentation. But I think there's just something about that look that you don't get from a smaller sensor camera. But it's really hard to describe. You'd have to try it for yourself. Now, one of the other things that I wanted to cover too is I get asked a lot about focus stacking and also diffraction, kind of as it pertains to this system. So it's not really something that I've ever noticed in, you know, my experience with the camera. So with, you know, I make sure that I kind of test all my lenses. That was a lot of the pre-shooting in Michigan before I left for this trip. I was also kind of testing these lenses out, finding out what the sweet spots are. A lot of lenses have kind of like an aperture sweet spot where they're giving the best, sharpest results. And so that's, kind of the range that I try to stay between. So on the 23 and the 30, I felt like F10 to F16 is where I was getting like the sharpest, best results. And most of the time when I'm shooting, I'm hyperfocal focusing. And I mean, you can Google that and go down a rabbit hole there, but basically it just means you're kind of picking a midpoint within your frame. That way, instead of focusing to infinity and then the focus falling off to where the things that are then the closest to the lens are kind of the most out of focus, you kind of pick a midpoint within your frame. That way the focus falls off evenly. And I think just you get sharper shots throughout your scene, or sharper things throughout your scene. But yeah, so I have a lot of friends that shoot GFX that focus stack when things are really extremely close and extremely far away. You can do that for sure, but all the stuff that you're seeing here is all just single shots. I'm going to show you a couple examples of some sharpness again and a few slides. But yeah, I think it's something I wouldn't necessarily worry about if you're coming from a different system. It's totally manageable. So last shot at the toadstools, I made sure I wanted to get that F32 sun star as the sun kind of popped up behind that main formation there. And then it was kind of really diffused clouds there on the horizon. So I didn't know if it was going to work out the best, but I'm definitely glad that I stayed and I got the shot. And then I hightailed it back to the Grand Canyon, another 4.5 hours of driving. And yeah, I arrived at the South Rim around 2 p.m., which gave me a ton of time to scout. Here, I knew I was going to be probably, with the 120 lens the majority of the time, picking out little compositions of interesting light and texture. Best part about this was it was January. I don't remember the day, but it was a great off season for the Grand Canyon. So there's a road that is normally only like a shuttle bus. Like you get on the bus and it takes you to a lookout point, and then you can wait for the bus and then go to a different lookout point. It was completely open to the public. So I could just drive my rental car and check out all of these different viewpoints and kind of pick the best one, that I wanted for the sunset. This ended up being the one. I just love the way that you can see the Colorado River kind of snakes back through the frame, all the way back in the foreground. There's just so many layers to this. And it just seemed like it was going to be perfect for me. And I just sat for a long time, again, just picking out those interesting light and combinations, waiting for golden hour to start. And when that sun started hitting these rock faces, I love that right image is one of my favorites. It's such I don't know, compositionally, it's nothing crazy, but there's something about just the texture of the snow to the desert. There's something that I love so much, being in the desert and seeing snow. And this is one of my favorite images of the entire trip, which is weird. I don't know why. I think, it's that added depth from that. I shot this wide open on the 120 at f4. So you have that kind of out of focus bush. And my focus point isn't the rocks in the background. It's kind of that ledge that has this weathered, I love the white rock right next to the orange. But I don't know. There's just something about this that really, really drew me into this scene. And a normal landscape photographer probably would have said, okay, I need to focus stack this. I need to shoot it at like f16 and I need to get 5 shots of depth. But I don't know. There was just something about shooting it wide open that I loved so much. And you still get so much incredible detail. So it didn't end up being the best sunset that I'd ever seen, but anytime you get to watch the canyon kind of descend into darkness and see the light hit all of these beautiful ridges, like it's just incredible experience. And again, back to, at this point, I'm usually on a tripod with most any other camera that I use, just because I don't want to like think that I'm getting sharp images. And then, I get into post-processing and there's like a little bit of a micro blur there. But, I really wanted to test what this camera could do. So you can see here, this is with the 23mm lens. Shot this at 1/6 of a second, handheld, and here's 100% crop. It's completely tack sharp, which is crazy. I mean, it's also crazy that you have 100 megapixels of resolution there. But yeah, I ended up only having to bump my ISO to like 320 or 400 for my last couple of images from this night, which again speaks to the insane light gathering capability of the large sensor. And then also just the IBIS is incredible. Just makes my job as a landscape photographer that much easier. And then this is my last kind of attempt at astrophotography for the trip. And I think I really found my stride with it. This is kind of the wrong winter's like the wrong time of year to be shooting astro. I know most astrophotographers are looking for like that beautiful Milky Way coming into this shot. But I'm such a space kid. I love stars, and so I think this it really the kind of hazy clouds in the foreground with that pink glow. I don't know. There's something that really, really drew me. I actually shot this exact tree on a previous trip during the day, and I knew that I wanted to come back and shoot it at night to try something completely different with it. So the next morning, this is like my last sunrise of the entire trip. I didn't get the like kind of direct hammering light that hits all those little ridges that I wanted. It was kind of more of a soft glowy type feel. But I mean, again, I got to sit here out on this ledge. I got kind of brave and went down on this little ledge and was just kind of hanging out with my cameras. And yeah, it was amazing. I actually accidentally almost posted to my Instagram story kind of a shot of both. I had two cameras on tripods, and one of them was the GFX 100S, and I almost posted that to my Instagram story pre-release, which would have been real fun. Thankfully, I didn't have service, so it didn't post, and found out later. So I know I wanted to highlight again the autofocus of this camera. And it's really tough to make a comparison when there really isn't a comparable camera on the market, right? When you compare it to way more expensive medium format cameras, like it just blows them out of the water with autofocus performance. And there is no other medium format camera that has sensor stabilization. So, in my experience, I'd say that it's very, very close to the autofocus speeds of an X-T4, but the lenses have a lot more and bigger glass to push around. So it's pretty close. It's like, maybe 80 to 90% of what an X-T4 can do, which is pretty incredible for a medium format camera. But this shot, like, going back to what I was talking about earlier, I'm coming from the GFX 50S, which I loved, but I never could have tracked a bird at 120 millimeters flying through the sky and 100% crop, get a completely sharp shot of a bird flying through the sky. Yeah, so it's pretty incredible for what it is, and kind of unbelievable that, for the way that it's priced and what it does, like you can kind of track some birds. So yeah, so I walked the rim trail back to my car. The sun finally kind of popped above those hazy clouds and started lighting up the interior of the canyon a little bit, which was amazing. Beautiful goodbye. I left the Grand Canyon and went back to Phoenix. Just outside of Phoenix, I was going to a spot called Lost Dutchman State Park. I wanted to photograph the Superstition Mountains. I'd been there on a previous trip, but I hadn't taken any photos. It was just kind of like a family thing. So yeah, headed back again, got there early enough to scout. There were all these beautiful cactuses around in the foreground. I had a 6 a.m. flight back home the next day, so I knew I wanted to be kind of closer to Phoenix to be able to get to the airport quickly. But yeah, so just kind of walked around. I even did a little hiking just to kind of get a feel for the area and see if there was anything that stuck out to me as far as where I wanted to shoot from, waiting for that beautiful golden hour light that you see here. Considering how scenic this entire park is, I couldn't go wrong no matter where I was. It was like 70 degrees, which is a stark contrast to the 20 degrees that I was at like the Grand Canyon, which is crazy. Magic of Arizona, right? But yeah, I don't know. I walked around. That you can see here on the right, I've finally put to test the 120's macro capabilities a little bit on a dead cactus. Just super interesting textures there. And now I have a huge obsession with cactuses. I don't know, there's something about them to me as a kid from the Midwest, who grew up in the Midwest. It's so foreign, it's so unique. And I feel like people always, you go through your life and people are always talking about how beautiful palm trees are and being at the beach and how amazing that is. The beaches don't really do it for me. I don't think I've ever taken a photo of a palm tree. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like this image right here kind of sparked this. I want to do some sort of documentary, like a book or some sort of like trip where I document like the American Southwest. I haven't really figured out exactly what it is yet, but this trip has like totally set that in motion. And I'm really excited to kind of figure that out more. And, I don't know, just work on this new project, because I don't really I think of the things that I do in terms of trips more often than not, like not necessarily projects. So it's cool to have like a project, an idea to move forward on. And so as the sun crept lower in the sky, you know, I got this beautiful, amazing send off. I swear that this sunset lasted for an hour after the sun had actually gone completely down. And then at that point, I noticed the tiny little rising crescent moon you can see there in the bottom right of the photo. So I was running around trying to find compositions where I could get some, you know, silhouetted cactuses in the foreground. But again, this shot here on the left, kind of blows my mind. It's a 25th of a second, and this was with the 120 millimeter lens handheld. It's completely amazing. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate you checking out. I don't know if we have any questions. If not, me and Francis can chat for a little bit about this awesome camera.
Yes, so there wasn't any more questions, but I do want to ask you one just because I think some people might wonder. So with the GFX 100S, so which computer are you using, and how does it handle, editing, 102 megapixel files? How's the performance and such?
Yeah, so thankfully, I have some experience with the GFX 100, right? Big brother. And when I was shooting last year, the GFX 100, I borrowed it a few times and took it on a couple trips. I was using a 13-inch, I think it was a 2018 13-inch MacBook Pro. So it only had it's like a quad core i7 processor and 16 gigs of RAM. And I mean, it wasn't blazing fast, but it wasn't like noticeably slow, right? It never like hindered me to the point where I was like, screw this, I need a new computer. It was fine. So now, thankfully, getting this camera kind of coincided to when I got the new M1 Mac Mini, also 16 gigs of RAM, and it just chews through the files. It's amazing. It's been awesome so far. So I think the one thing to note is that the lossless compression that I talked about a little bit, like the one thing that you do run into, I don't use Lightroom. I use Capture One and then usually Bridge and Adobe Camera Raw. I've just never liked Lightroom. It's always slow and I don't like catalogs. But I think the one thing that I've noticed is that because like the raw processing engine has to kind of uncompress those files a little bit, preview generation can be slower. But to me, it's worth it saving, like 60 to 70 megabytes a piece on file size to have to wait a little longer for image previews to generate. But yeah, other than that, no, I mean, I don't have like a crazy supercomputer or anything. I think I've used, I mean, it was funny the other day, I used an iPad Pro, one of the first the 2018 iPad Pros. I actually opened up a GFX 100S raw file in Affinity Photo and was like tweaking. It took a little while for it because it's the older iPad. I assumed that the newer ones would be faster, but yeah, still was able to open it up in Affinity Photo and like run through. I was testing something for a friend, so that was pretty cool.
Yeah, well, yeah, I do have an M1 Mac Mini, the same as yours, the 16 gig, and I've put some files through, and I think the key in Lightroom is enabling the smart previews, just because once they're done, it's kind of it's there.
Sure.
But yeah, I'm with you on that. I think it's a big misconception that 100 megapixel, you'll need like a brand new computer.
Right.
And as you said, I think the one thing to consider is more of like hard drive space. But again, I am in your clan where I always use lossless compressed, even on the X series, because I know that the quality is there. And, if you can cut the size of the file in like almost half, it's always welcome. Even, nowadays, hard drives are cheaper than they used to be, even like SSDs, but still, it's nice to not, fill a bunch of hard drives.
Right. Well, I mean, and look at it this way. So one of my best photographer friends is another Fujifilm X photographer, Allison Conklin. She's a wedding photographer in the Philadelphia area. She's amazing. Her work's insane. And she shoots weddings on the GFX 100 and then now the GFX 100S. And she won't get mad at me for saying this. She is not a techie person, right? I don't know what computer she has, but she's not the kind of person that's like researching computers and getting the best computer. And she's fine editing wedding photo, a whole wedding of GFX 100 images. So I think it's definitely, like you said, it's just a misconception that you're going to need an all new setup. But yeah, I think the one thing that I did change for this camera is I use brand doesn't matter, but an SD card. I usually only do 128 gigabyte SD cards, and I bought my first 256. So in the dual card slots of the GFX 100, I have a 256 and a 128. I don't really need it, but just in case I go on an extra long trip, it's nice to have that extra padding. But yeah, otherwise, like everything in my setup has stayed exactly the same. So it's not like I've had to change anything, in particular.
That's good. So if anyone has any question, okay, yeah. Actually, that's not a question. You can look at the chat. It's just a comment for you.
Oh,
but if you have
you.
any questions, you can. I guess you can unmute yourself. I guess one at a time, or you can put it in the chat if you want me to ask it.
If you're thinking of your questions, I do have one more thing that I forgot. So I did kind of touch on that, it shares a battery with the XT4. I always forget the model number. What is it? W30, MPW235. Yes. So it's these batteries rather than the big kind of boxy old GFX batteries. But what's amazing to me, and Francis can chime in with the numbers because I'm not a numbers guy, but like you get more shots on this battery than the GFX 100 does on the bigger battery, which is crazy to me. It's what, 430 versus like 380, or it's something like that.
I think it's I think it's, I would say around 400 for the GFX 100 with the 2 batteries, and then you get 436 if I remember correctly with the 100S. Which
is crazy. And so so for the trip, I had 4 batteries total. So I kind of had 2 for the XT4 and then 2 for the GFX 100S. And again, like I said, I was shooting a YouTube video. My XT4 was kind of my vlog camera the whole time. So it's, I'm using batteries on it too. I never got to a point where I was like freaking out that I, was low on batteries or anything. I don't think I even ever had to bump over to I kind of had, one in the cameras and then a backup for each. And I never had to bump over to that other backup battery. And again, I mean, if I had a long drive or something, I'm plugging in USB-C chargers and just plugging them on the drive or whatever. But I think that's pretty, oh, look, Mark chimes in the chat with 460. Look at that. 460. Awesome. Yeah, but so I just wanted to make a point of that because I don't know, it's just really awesome. The battery, the battery life of this thing on these small batteries and getting to share them between the 2 cameras for me is a huge selling point.
Yeah, and I think it might be worth it to mention as well that the GFX 100S is PD compatible. So if you do have like a PD compatible battery pack, and if you want to shoot some time lapse maybe or long exposure or whatnot, or just charge it, you can use an external battery, which are getting more and more affordable and smaller as well in size. So that's pretty cool as well.
Yeah, that's awesome.
All right. Well, it doesn't seem. Yeah, there's no questions. If you wanted to add anything, Brian, if not, I think we can.
I'm trying to think. I wish I could have added a few extra slides to my presentation. I've been shooting a lot with it lately, and I actually just got to go to some dunes up in northern Michigan a couple weeks ago. It was I just went to a Disney trip with the family for last weekend. The weekend before that, we went to the dunes just for a day, 2 days, just so I could shoot some stuff with the new camera, this new series that I've been working on. And I don't know, it's just really incredible. It's just really fun to shoot with, for sure. And
the size in itself, right?
Yeah, I think that's the big point, right? It's like I love the 50S, but even with its like little backpack where the battery goes, it was always just kind of like it didn't really fit in my bags, and it was just like I usually had to decide if I was going to take it or just not going to take it. Whereas, you know, with this thing, it just fits right in there with the gear that I normally carry with me. So I think, yeah, oh, look at you. You got the backpack right there. Yeah, it's crazy that this camera is double the resolution, has the sensor stabilization, and it's still smaller somehow, which is crazy. Oh, Mark has a question. Are there any lenses you wish you had brought with you on the trip? This is tough. I bought the 100 to 200 because that lens to me, I thought I had it right here. It's probably in my bag, but that lens is so fun to me. I love the range. I think I did love the 120, and I'm kind of like, I was a prime lens snob for a while. Just I felt like those made me more creative than having a zoom. I always felt like having a zoom made me lazy. And then I fell in love with the 50 to 140. And I kind of, you know, changed my mind on all of those things. But I feel like the 100 to 200 is definitely my favorite lens for the GF system. Just the versatility, and then also the image stabilization on that is crazy for the hand holdability and everything. And it's not really big. I had that shot early on in my presentation where I was kind of shooting with it. It's not, you know, massive for a medium format zoom lens, right?
And it's not that heavy either.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's probably my favorite lens. If I took that on the trip in place of the 120, I think I probably would have been happier. But you know, I had the 3 primes, and I made do for sure. I'm thinking about getting that 23 though, because there are some things that I want to go ultra wide for. So yeah.
And I'm going to ask you this question I asked you last time we did this, and it might be of some use to people. How do you, you know, the 100 to 200 is a 5.6 aperture.
Yeah.
So did you feel at any point that this was a limitation for you?
No, and I think, you know, again, I'm not really a portrait. I feel like most people that are looking for that, like, you know, really, really like a 2.8 or whatever, f4, are more portrait shooters that are trying to get that, like the extra fall off. But that's not really the way that I like to shoot. I do shoot wide open a lot. But I think the 5.6, I showed that image early on that was kind of like the corn stalks with the light and the, you know, that was the 100 to 200 at 5.6. I mean, it had a ton of fall off. I think that's when I realized, like, yes, the compression, when you're at 200 and 5.6, like, you get a crazy amount of fall off. So I feel like it would be a killer portrait lens. No, I definitely don't think it's a limitation. I think, you know, they did that obviously to keep it smaller and lighter. Because if it was an f4, it would be probably twice the size or something, you know. But yeah, well, look at the 250. The 250 f4 has that. It's, you know, kind of big and bulging, which is also an amazing lens. But I opted for the 100 to 200 just because I like to keep things in my kit small. But no, I think, yeah, you will be really happy with 5.6. I wouldn't make, like, that wouldn't be a deterrent for me, because you still get some really good fall off. I did the shots of the dune that I was talking about. So I've been doing this series where I'm kind of like, I mean, all boiled down, and basically like using my son as a subject in my landscape scenes. In an astronaut costume. He's got this cool astronaut costume. There's a lot more to it than that. Visually, that's what it is. There's a lot more to it about like fatherhood and creativity and imagination. There's like this whole thing that I'm kind of, the story that I'm telling there. But, you know, when we went to the dunes, like, so I have him, you know, on a dune, and then there's dunes and the beautiful dunes in the background. I wish I had these photos to be able to show you, but like, I love shooting low. And so like that, you know, that first like initial thing that's in front of you is like real blurry. And then you have like your subject, and then the fall off from everything in the background. And so I think, you know, there are things that you can do to even further accentuate and make it seem like it's maybe even more wide open than a 5.6 when need be. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that lens is for sure my favorite GF lens, no doubt.
Nice. I guess I do have another question, and I'm not a landscape photographer. I'm more of a portrait photographer and somewhat street photographer. And I remember at some point there was a guy who asked me to try the 250, and he told me he was a landscape photographer. And to me, it seemed pretty weird because in my mind, I associate landscape with wide angle lenses. So can
Sure.
you, I don't know, guide me or explain to me how a telephoto would be useful in a landscape situation? Like
Absolutely.
why do you like having, you know, a telephoto for landscape?
Well, I think like for me, I'm gonna share my screen again too, because I think this will
Yeah.
help illustrate the point. I think for me, screen one, a telephoto, like it allows you, can you see that? Okay, you're presenting your screen, it's booting up.
Yeah.
So here's one of the shots I was talking about.
Nice.
So that's at f5.6. You can see kind of how I set the camera closer to the ground to get that initial blur of the foreground. And then you have, you know, him in focus and then kind of the fall off to everything in the background. But I think, so yeah, when it comes to the landscape photography, and I wonder if I have another example here. I think here's a good example. Like, you know, I shot this with the 30 and it's just, I don't know, there's so much there. I think when it comes to wide angle lenses, like as a landscape photographer, a lot of times you just have to kind of deal with things in your scene and you have to be okay with the fact that maybe there's a tree that you don't necessarily like that's in your frame just because you're shooting so wide. But when you're able to zoom in and then you're like compressing things together so you get interesting compositional elements that way, but you get to be really picky about your compositions. So, you know, down to like the little tree that you just don't want, you can maybe move over a couple steps and then it's not in your frame anymore. I think that's one of my favorite things about shooting with a telephoto. I feel like it's almost like a leveling up for landscape photographer where, you know, you have to be very compositionally minded. Otherwise you're not going to be a great landscape photographer. And I think when you use a telephoto lens, you get to nitpick your compositions so much that I don't know, just it really does kind of help, you know, in what you do. I think I've been using the 64 by 20, is it 64-25, the Hasselblad X-Pan crop mode. And this is another shot with the 100 to 200, just in like the crazy crop mode. And you know, I don't know, you get these really interesting kind of, I just really I'm addicted to like making a good composition. And so I think using a telephoto forces you to have to make good compositions. Otherwise, like you just have nothing. So yeah, I think that's definitely one of the biggest reasons why I love. Now this, you know, here's a 30 millimeter shot, right? And this is just a wide angle. Like I had to deal, like normally I would hate this kind of tree in my frame, but it kind of works with the composition, right? I framed it so that the lighthouse was kind of sitting in between all of this foliage. But like, I would have much rathered, you know, step way back and find a composition. I don't think I have one here to show you. But yeah, I would have much rather stepped way back. And here's a good one with the 100 to 200, right? Instead of being like right up close and dealing, I could step way back and then zoom in. I don't think this was fully zoomed in. What focal length was this at? Does it say over here? 79 millimeter. No.
Yeah,
No, it was at 100. Yeah, so it was all the way zoomed out, but still I was able to kind of nitpick my composition more and place things in my scene versus just getting really close and then having to deal with everything, you know?
Makes sense.
So I think that's what it is for me, for sure.
I might have to give it a try.
It was a game changer for me, man. I mean, like seriously, I like I said, I was very much a prime lens snob for the longest time. And I think I got the 50 to 140 because I was still shooting a lot of weddings. I was like in my transition away from Canon to Fujifilm. And I got the 50 to 140 because I was shooting weddings. And then I just started I started bringing it with me for landscape stuff. And it like unlocked this. It's like a cheat. I swear having a telephoto lens is like a cheat code for landscape photography. It's cool.
Well, that kind of, yeah, I mean, again, like I said, I'm not a landscape photographer, but I'll definitely give it a try. I'm going to the cottage next weekend, and we have a lot of mountains and stuff, so I'll give that a try. See how
There
it
you go.
can
Do
make
it.
it.
I want to see. I want to see what you get.
I'll keep you posted. All right.
Awesome.
Well, we're at our time limit, so I want to thank everybody who joined in and stayed until the end to listen to Brian's presentation and witness these extremely nice landscape photos. I'm truly blown away every time I see them. The cactuses ones are my favorite. There's just something
So
about
good,
it.
right? I love cactuses. Love cactuses.
So good. But yeah, so thank you everyone for joining us tonight, today, this afternoon. Brian, if you have any last words to say before we close this up.
So just thanks for having me. I appreciate you all sticking around, hanging out with us. Yeah, and I'm pretty active on social media on Instagram and Twitter. So if you do have a question and just didn't feel comfortable diving in the chat, feel free to shoot me a DM. Like I'm constantly answering gear questions and helping people out there. So I'm an open book. Just at Brian Minear, BryanMinear on all platforms.
Excellent. Well, I've put the links to your Instagram, Twitter, and website. So if people want to, quickly click on them. But that's going to be it. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.